Senator Ludlam. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. Do you ever get the feeling around this place that it doesn't matter what question is before this chamber, it doesn't matter what issue we are discussing, but it doesn't matter what question we are asking, but the answer that invariably comes back from the Greens every time is more taxes, higher taxes. That is their answer to pretty much every problem facing the globe today. It doesn't matter if it's climate change, if it's royalties in the mining sector, or indeed housing affordability, the issue we're discussing today. Their policy is more taxes. Now, I think most people understand and expect that from the Greens, that they support higher taxes, they support a bigger government and more control, and that is their right and that is fine. What people don't always expect that the Labor Party will share their views on this, and on this issue, the Labor Party are joining with the Greens to try and hike up taxes on housing in this country, and particularly to hike up taxes on those that invest in housing in Australia. And there is around 1.3 million people in Australia which use some form of negative gearing for housing, and all of those people will be facing a tax increase if a Labor Green government gets back in the next term, because there is no doubt that whatever the Greens say now will become Labor policy later, because if the Labor Party did get back into government, they would need the Greens, they would need their preferences, and they would have to do, they need their votes in this chamber, and they would have to do their bidding. And the Greens want to put up taxes on housing. This removal of negative gearing is a tax increase, plain and simple, and it's something that should be opposed by anybody who wants to see more investment in housing, because you do not encourage more investment in an asset by taxing it more. If you tax it more, you'll get less investment in that particular part of our economy, and that will make our affordability issues in Australia even starker and worse. And Senator Ludlam just said earlier in an interjection to my comments that we're going to grandfather it. Well, you can't grandfather this stuff because it's capital markets and it's an asset price. And when you're pricing assets, you look at what the returns will be over time, not just today, certainly not in the past, because that doesn't matter. You look at what's going to be the returns in the future. That's how you determine an asset price. Well, the price you pay for a house or shares or any asset is going to be what you expect, or the income you expect from those assets over time. And under the Greens and under the Labor Party, potentially, if you buy a housing asset in the future, you'll receive lower returns because you'll not be able to have access to the same taxation treatment as other assets do, and that will mean, surprise, surprise, that the price that you receive for that asset will be lower. So for those 1.3 million Australians who have invested in housing under existing tax laws, who have taken risks under the current treatment that's been around for decades, they face that negative impact thanks to the uncertainty that's being created by the Labor and Green parties, and that is not a solution to encourage more investment in housing, because if we create uncertainty about the returns that might flow to investment in housing, we will not get more housing. And if we want to bring housing prices down, if we were serious about trying to help Australians afford their own home, we need more supply of land, we need more supply of housing. We can do one other thing. Sorry, I should say, there are two blades to the scissors, as always. One blade is the supply, the other blade is demand. We could try and hurt demand. We could try and reduce demand for housing. But the only way we'll seriously do that to have a serious impact on housing would be to have some kind of economic slowdown or, God forbid, a recession, Mr Acting Deputy President, and I certainly don't want to see that happen in this country. While ever we have strong economic growth or even moderate economic growth in Australia, there will always be slightly increasing demand for housing in our country, and that will have slight upward pressure on housing. And may that continue, because I want to see an Australia that has a strong economy, and whereas the Labor Party seems to want lower house prices at the moment, and lower house prices are a recipe for a weaker economy. But we can try and moderate the house price growth by moderately increasing supply for housing. Now, we don't here in this chamber and in this at the federal level of government control the release of land for housing. It's a state government issue, and certainly I think that state governments have at times been slow to develop land, particularly at the fringes of cities and also urban consolidation. But it's not actually our area of expertise, and we should try to stick to our knitting more in Australian government, because we always seem to have this preference to try and stick our fingers into other people's problems when we have enough problems to deal with here in the federal parliament without trying to solve the solutions of states, try to solve the problems, of state parliaments. Now, the former Labor government, the Rudd Labor government, tried to do this. They tried to set up a major cities unit. They tried to put through COAG, housing supply reform. They tried to establish a national rental affordability scheme. All of those proposals came to naught. Indeed, the rental affordable scheme was massively scammed and has had to be shut down. And, through you, Mr Acting Deputy President, I didn't believe that the initial intent of this program was to fund housing for universities, overseas university students, but that's what it ended up funding. That's what it ended up funding, we should not try to trespass into those areas of state government responsibility. And when we do, that's when mistakes like what happened with the National Rental Affordability Scheme occurs. Now, the Greens make some grand complaints too, some grand claims that negative gearing has somehow caused this inflation in house prices, both over the last decade and also the more recent surge, particularly in Sydney, in Melbourne. Well, Senator Ludlam was very, through you, Mr Acting Deputy President, was very keen to look at the data about rents in the late 1980s in Sydney and compare it to other cities, but he doesn't want to look at the data in house prices over a longer period of time, because negative gearing has been around for decades. Negative gearing has been something that we've had in our tax system for decades, and we have only seen rapidly increasing house prices in Australia for the last 10 or 15 years. So how can negative gearing be responsible for the increase in house prices when it hasn't actually, we haven't changed anything about negative gearing in the last 10 or 15 years? And now, Mr Deputy President, Senator Ludlam interjects with capital gains tax changes, and I will take that interjection. One thing he never mentions is that when capital gains tax changed in 1999, I believe it was with the support of the Labor Party as well, it was a change from a real basis for capital gains taxation to a nominal base for capital gains taxation. So before 1999 you could remove the effect of inflation from your capital gains tax calculations. After 1999 it was based on whatever the inflation, the capital price increase was with inflation. Now it's actually not clear that change, certainly not in theory a change which supports investment in housing. It depends on the rate of inflation relative to the rate of real house price growth, and in fact over time those two things tend to be about 2.5% each, about 5% growth in housing over time, and it actually is neutral whether you have a nominal basis for capital gains tax or a real basis for capital gains tax. And no other country in the world taxes capital gains on a nominal basis at the full rate of income tax for those reasons. And finally, Mr Acting Deputy President, I want to say that one thing that goes unremarked in this chamber, and something that I want to raise here from this corner of the chamber, is that if we are serious about looking for lower housing prices and more housing affordability, the one area we should be looking at is outside the city limits, because there is abundant supply of affordable housing and affordable land in our regional and remote areas. Indeed, house prices in regional Queensland, where I'm from, tend to be about half what they are in our major cities, or less if you're just looking at Sydney, even less than half. And what we actually can do in this chamber, we can't release land, but we can create policies which drive growth and opportunity and jobs in those regional areas to attract people to those areas. We can't force people, and I don't want to force people to move to Townsville or Cairns or Mackay, although I think the standard of living there is much better than in Sydney, in my view, my humble view. But we can encourage them by creating the jobs and opportunity which will get them to move, encourage them to move, and that will both do two things. It will reduce the demand for housing in our major cities and help relieve price pressure there, and it will support construction and growth and development in our regional areas, and it will improve our housing affordability across the board. And that's why I think one of the best solutions to our housing affordability problems is regional development. And I believe very soon the Abbott government, the Abbott Trust government, will release its Northern Australian White Paper, which will try to supercharge development in those areas that I know are dear to Senator McLucas as well, like Cairns, Townsville, Mackay, Rockhampton, and that is one solution to our housing affordability
Thank you,
issues.
Senator Canavan.